Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a group of people you've probably thought about in passing but never really stopped to imagine as actual human beings. The royal food tasters. Yes, those unlucky souls whose job was to take one for the team. Or more specifically, take one for the king. Now, maybe you've seen them in movies. The nervous guy standing in the corner with a silver plate, poking at a suspicious roast chicken. He takes a bite, pauses dramatically, and everyone holds their breath to see if he's about to keel over. And if he doesn't, the monarch digs in. Problem solved. It sounds like a pretty bad job, right? But here's the real twist. What happened to those tasters after their monarchs died? Because unless they died young from arsenic soup, they had to figure out the rest of their lives. And spoiler alert, ex-food taster was not a career path with a lot of obvious next steps. So tonight, we're going to float gently through history. From ancient Rome to medieval courts to Renaissance Europe, and quietly peek into the fates of these forgotten fork bearers. Sometimes they got rich, sometimes they were quietly murdered, and sometimes they just faded back into the crowd, probably never eating stew the same way again. Let's start slowly with the Romans. The pregustator, ancient Rome's taste testers. In Rome, the job title was pregustator, which is Latin for the one who tastes before. Simple, elegant, slightly terrifying, and the Roman emperors, bless their paranoid little hearts, adored the idea. These were men who barely trusted their own shadows. Poison was the Uber Eats of political assassination, and so emperors often demanded whole squads of food tasters, wine sippers, and general human shields. The most famous case, Emperor Claudius. Yes, that Claudius, the stammering, limping emperor who somehow stumbled into power after Caligula got the predictable dagger treatment. Claudius loved his pregustators. He had a whole system in place to make sure no oyster, no mushroom, no goblet of wine reached his lips without someone else taking the first gulp. And yet, here comes the irony. Claudius was, allegedly, killed by a plate of poisoned mushrooms, either served up by his ambitious wife Agrippina, or at least approved by her. So, what exactly happened to his food tasters? The historical record is vague. Some say the poison was so concentrated that the tasters were bypassed, with the mushrooms slipped in after the check. Others think the tasters were bribed to ignore the signs. But here's the thing. After Claudius died, nobody bothered to ask, hey, what about those guys who were supposed to protect him? They vanish from the story, maybe quietly executed, maybe quietly retired. Because let's be honest, if your entire CV reads, failed to stop emperor from being murdered with fungi, you're not exactly going to get glowing references. Sliding into medieval Europe. Now let's float ahead a few centuries. Picture the drafty castles, long wooden banquet tables, greasy meat pies, and goblets of ale. The poison paranoia was alive and well. Medieval kings often employed personal food tasters, sometimes chosen from the lower nobility, sometimes from the royal household staff. They were supposed to be trusted, but trusted in this context just means trusted enough to eat in front of me without spitting it on the floor. Take England, for example. King John, yes, the villain from Robin Hood, known mostly for being the worst Plantagenet in the room, was so paranoid about poison that he required multiple tasters at every meal. Ironically, he died from dysentery after eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider. So, not exactly poison, just medieval digestive health. And the poor tasters probably survived that one, though I imagine they swore off peaches for life. By the Tudor era, the job became a bit more formalized. Henry VIII, the guy with more wives than functional arteries, had a rotating staff of food tasters. They were often young men from noble families, considered honored to risk their intestines for the king. And here's the kicker. Sometimes those tasters parlayed the job into cushy royal favor, because if the king saw you every day stabbing his roast chicken, he might just remember your name when it came time for promotions. So yes, occasionally food tasters managed to climb the social ladder. But more often, they just existed in that weird liminal space. Not really servants, not really nobles, just the guy who eats the king's pie before the king does. The afterlife of a food taster's career. Now, this is where it gets interesting and kind of bleak. When a king died, the the food taster's job instantly ended. No royal stomach, no royal paycheck. So what then? Well, sometimes they were reassigned to the next monarch. Congratulations, you're still a professional mouth, but not always, especially if the new monarch wanted their own people, which meant tasters might be quietly retired with a pension or tossed back into obscurity. A lot depended on how loyal they were or how useful. If they were connected, they might get shuffled into another court job managing kitchens or overseeing banquets. Imagine introducing yourself at parties. I used to be the royal food taster. Now I supervise table linens. But there are darker stories, too. In many courts, if a king died of suspicious circumstances, anyone connected with his food might be blamed. Cooks, cupbearers, tasters, all at risk of being imprisoned or executed. Because nothing says justice like blaming the guy who ate the soup. For example, in Renaissance Italy, where poisoning was basically a competitive sport, food tasters often met sticky ends. If a duke keeled over, the taster might be accused of conspiracy. It didn't matter if he was just an innocent stomach on legs. Suspicion alone was enough. The case of Cassius Cornelius Lentulus. Let's float back to Rome for one more famous case. During the reign of Emperor Commodus, the gladiator-obsessed megalomaniac who thought he was Hercules, one of his pregustators was actually implicated in a plot. His name was Cassius Cornelius Lentulus. Allegedly, he was part of the scheme to poison Commodus, which, to be fair, wasn't that hard. Commodus was constantly bathing in perfume, drinking heavily, and wrestling slaves. Not exactly an indestructible lifestyle, but the point here is this: food tasters could go from invisible servants to central villains overnight. If a ruler died, people wanted scapegoats. And who better than the man who literally put the food in his mouth? So what happened to Lentulus? He was executed, of course, because that's usually how Roman palace intrigue ended. The quiet fade-outs. But not every story is bloody. Many tasters probably just faded back into private life. Maybe they got minor estates. Maybe they ran kitchens in monasteries. Maybe they just became that one weird uncle at family dinners who refuses to eat stew unless someone else tries it first. There are even scattered accounts of tasters being given lifelong pensions for their service. Sort of a thank you for not dying in my soup bonus, which is oddly wholesome in a depressing way. And this brings us to the real conclusion of tonight's sleepy little journey through poisoned banquets. Being a royal food taster was both high stakes and deeply boring. High stakes because you might die at dinner. Boring because most of the time you just didn't. And when the king finally did die, you either got shuffled into a new job, quietly retired, or, if you were really unlucky, got accused of murder. Let's float over, in the next part, to the Renaissance and Baroque courts, where paranoia reached new artistic heights, poisons had their own PR campaigns, and food tasters sometimes became pawns in dynastic soap operas. So, we left off with the Middle Ages, where food tasters were hanging around castles, nervously chewing chicken legs, and occasionally being blamed for their boss's indigestion. Now let's float forward into the Renaissance and Baroque eras. This is where court life got fancier, meals got bigger, poisons got sneakier, and paranoia became an art form. Because if there's one thing a Renaissance duke loved more than commissioning a portrait, it was fearing that his cousin was trying to poison his breakfast wine. The Italian poison panic. If medieval England gave us peaches and dysentery, Renaissance Italy gave us poison as a lifestyle accessory. Seriously, 15th and 16th century Italy had a reputation for poison the way modern France has a reputation for wine. Everyone whispered about it. Every duke, duchess, and backstabbing nephew was supposedly armed with some vial of mysterious powder. And whether that was entirely true or not, it was enough to terrify every noble into hiring more tasters than cooks. Let's take the infamous Borgia family. Rodrigo Borgia, aka Pope Alexander VI, and his charming children, Cesare and Lucrezia. They had such a reputation for poison that even centuries later, novels and operas still portray them as casually slipping arsenic into every chalice. Now, were the Borgias actually that poison-happy? Historians argue about it. But here's what matters for our sleepy journey. Their food tasters probably lived in a constant state of low-level dread. Every papal feast, Every banquet, every glass of wine, they had to be the guinea pigs. And here's the kicker. If someone actually did keel over at the table, chances are the taster wasn't long for this world either. Because if the Pope dies after dinner, who's the first person everyone looks at? Not the cook, not the bishop who brought dessert. No, it's the poor taster, slumped in the corner with a guilty-looking spoon. So what happened to them after their papal bosses died? Honestly, nothing glamorous. They vanish from the record, which tells us one thing. The best-case scenario for a food taster was being forgotten. The French flair for suspicion. Let's float over to France. If Italy loved its poisons, France loved its rituals. The French court was an endless carousel of ceremony. And by the 16th century, that extended to food tasting. Under the Valois kings, the Grand Decanson, basically the royal cupbearer, was in charge of pouring and tasting the king's wine. This wasn't some lowly servant. It was a prestigious office. Because what screams prestige more than risking your life on a Tuesday for someone else's Merlot? But here's where it gets extra weird. The tasting ritual itself became almost theatrical. Imagine. The cupbearer pours the wine, tastes it, bows dramatically, hands it off, and everyone politely pretends that he didn't just possibly doom himself. And yet, when French kings died, their cupbearers rarely made the headlines. Take Henry III of France. He was assassinated by a friar in 1589. No poison involved. So his tasters? Irrelevant. Probably shuffled into the service of Henry IV, or maybe just retired to quietly drink wine without sharing. In fact, the French tasters often got absorbed into the ever-growing ecosystem of court titles. They went from risking death to arguing about seating arrangements at banquets, which honestly might have been worse. England goes full Tudor. Now let's check back in with England during the era of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Henry, as I mentioned before, had food tasters, because of course he did. Here's a man who executed 2 of his wives, bankrupted his nobles, and ate like every meal might be his last. Spoiler, it wasn't poison that got him. It was gout, obesity, and infected ulcers. But in the meantime, his tasters lived in constant proximity to his terrifying table manners. And here's the thing about Henry's tasters. They were usually young nobles. Being the king's taster wasn't a punishment. It was considered an honor, which is a very Renaissance way of saying, congratulations, you're expendable but close enough to the king to be noticed. What happened to them when Henry finally died in 1547? Most probably drifted into the service of Edward VI, his sickly young son. But here's the tragedy. Edward didn't live long. He died at age 15. So again, his tasters lost their job almost as soon as they got it. That's 2 monarchs in a row. Imagine updating your resume. Professional food taster for 2 kings. Both died anyway. By Elizabeth's reign, the paranoia around poison had escalated. The Queen was famously cautious, and her food tasters were carefully supervised. Every dish passed through multiple layers of inspection. Did that stop her worrying? Of course not. But it did give a lot of minor courtiers job security, until Elizabeth died, and they were out on the street again. Poison as a science. Now, one reason food tasters remained relevant well into the 17th century is because poison itself got upgraded. Medieval poison was often just ground-up plants. Renaissance poison was chemistry. Alchemists were out there experimenting with arsenic, mercury, and all kinds of fun powders. And the results were terrifyingly effective, which meant rulers doubled down on tasters. But here's the irony. By this period, poisons were often slow-acting. Arsenic, for example, could take hours or even days to kill. So the food taster munching a mouthful of roast pork wouldn't necessarily show symptoms right away. The king might eat happily only to keel over a week later, which raises the awkward question. What was the point of the taster anymore? Mostly psychological. They weren't preventing death so much as providing a small illusion of safety, like a human security blanket in doublet and hose. And when their monarchs finally died, tasters were often discarded like outdated props. If they were lucky, they found another nervous noble to serve. If not, They went home and tried not to think about how many cups of suspicious wine they'd survived. The Baroque drama. By the 17th and 18th centuries, courts were getting bigger, meals more elaborate, and poison scandals more infamous. Take Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His reign was so long, and his meals so massive that food tasting became a whole performance. Every dish was checked, tasted, and presented in ritual order. Did that stop Louis from outliving almost everyone around him? No. He survived to age 76, gouty and miserable, while most of his family members dropped dead earlier. The tasters? Again, forgotten in the paperwork. But in other courts, the paranoia never let up. In Russia, the Tsars maintained entire squads of food tasters, because Russian court politics were basically a live-action soap opera, and poisoning was always rumored to be in fashion. One poor taster in the court of Peter the Great supposedly keeled over after a suspicious glass of kvass. And yet, Peter himself lived on, more likely killed by years of heavy drinking and infections than poison. The taster just became a cautionary anecdote. The after the king dies question. So let's answer the big sleepy question again. What happened to these tasters once the kings, popes, or dukes finally kicked the bucket? Usually they were recycled. If the successor trusted them, they stayed. If not, they were reassigned, pensioned off, or quietly dismissed. In some Italian states, retired tasters even got ceremonial pensions, little stipends that basically said, "Thanks for eating cheese on our behalf for 20 years. But in darker cases, if a monarch's death looked suspicious, tasters were scapegoated. They could be imprisoned, tortured, or executed, whether or not they were guilty. Because when a king dies young, someone has to take the blame. And better the expendable mouth in the corner than a powerful noble. So in short, the life of a Renaissance or Baroque taster was a paradox. Close to power but never secure. Trusted but never respected. Always useful, until the day your employer died when you became disposable. Let's float next into part 3, where we'll look at the strange rituals of royal dining in the 18th and 19th centuries. By then, poison paranoia was still around, but mixed with new fears like germs, revolutions, and frankly terrible hygiene. And the food tasters? They were still there. Sometimes ceremonial, sometimes tragic, and sometimes just waiting for history to forget them all over again. So, by the 1700s, Europe had gotten a little less medieval. Castles were slowly being replaced by palaces with actual windows. People were bathing slightly more often. And monarchs, bless them, were still eating like hippos in velvet chairs. And yet, despite the powdered wigs, Enlightenment philosophy, and all the talk of progress, one thing never really went away. The paranoia that someone somewhere was trying to slip something nasty into the royal soup. Which meant, yes, food tasters were still very much a thing. Though by now, their role had shifted. Less about actual safety. More about ritual, tradition, and giving the king or queen a little psychological pat on the back. The court of Louis XV. Ceremony over safety. Let's start in France again. The Bourbons loved their ceremonies almost as much as their predecessors, the Valois. At Versailles, the royal meal was called the Grand Couvert. Basically, the king ate dinner in public while courtiers stood around pretending not to notice how much bread he was consuming. Before anything reached the royal lips, it had to be tasted. Dishes were presented, inspected, tasted by servants of rank, and only then set before His Majesty. But here's the thing, by the 18th century, poison wasn't the biggest killer in Europe anymore. It was germs, dysentery, cholera, contaminated meat. The poor tasters were as likely to get sick from spoiled fish as from arsenic. Which meant, in some cases, they were the canaries in the coal mine for food safety, a royal early warning system against salmonella. Lucky them. And what happened after the kings died? Same story as before. The tasters either stuck around if the next king wanted them, or they quietly disappeared into the folds of court bureaucracy. If they were smart, they'd angle for some pension or minor office. If not, they just faded. Louis XVI, of course, didn't die from poison at all. He died from guillotine, which no taster on earth could prevent. So his tasters? Out of a job in a much more final way. Across the channel, the Hanoverians. Meanwhile, in England, The Hanoverian kings were carrying on with their German accents, their endless wars, and their love of food. George I and George II both relied on the traditional royal household setup, tasters included. But again, by this time it was largely symbolic. George III, the famous Mad King, technically had tasters too. But his problem wasn't poison. It was his own brain chemistry. No amount of cautious sipping from a servant was going to save him from what modern historians think was either bipolar disorder or porphyria. And when George III finally died, after decades of decline, nobody even remembered the tasters. They were probably reassigned to his son, George IV. And if you know anything about George IV, you can imagine the nightmare of tasting his meals. This was a man so overweight he had to be hoisted into bed with a crane. He was constantly overindulging in food, alcohol, and sugar. If you were his food taster, you weren't just risking poison, you were risking diabetes by proximity. The Russians, still terrified of poison. Now let's float over to Russia, where paranoia about poison never went out of style. The Tsars were always a little, let's say, anxious, and for good reason. Russian court politics were brutal. If you weren't stabbed, you might be strangled. And if not that, poisoned. Catherine the Great, yes, the one with the endless rumors and the actual empire-expanding brain, kept a squad of loyal tasters. She ate carefully, often preferring simple dishes, and insisted on multiple layers of tasting before she touched anything. Ironically, she died of a stroke. But her tasters? They probably just shuffled along to serve Paul I. Which might not have been a good deal, since Paul lasted only 5 years before being assassinated in his bedroom. Once again, not poisoned, just killed the old-fashioned way. The tasters must have been relieved it wasn't their fault for once. The Japanese imperial court. And it wasn't just Europe. Let's drift east for a moment because the Japanese emperors had their own version of food tasters well into the 19th century. At the imperial court in Kyoto, a whole team of officials was responsible for sampling food before it reached the emperor. This wasn't just about poison. It was about ritual purity, tradition, and making sure the food was acceptable in a cosmic sense. The poor tasters weren't just risking poison. They were shouldering the responsibility of ritual failure. When emperors died, as they inevitably did from illness or old age, their tasters just kept serving the next in line. Unlike Europe, where tasters might be dismissed, Japan treated the role more as an inherited office. Safer in some ways, but just as thankless. American presidents joined the club. By the 19th century, even across the Atlantic, the tradition survived. American presidents, believe it or not, sometimes had informal food tasters. Abraham Lincoln, for example, occasionally had soldiers or staff taste his meals during the Civil War, especially when threats against his life were high. He worried about assassination, correctly as it turned out, though of course it wasn't poison that killed him. His food tasters probably felt both relieved and slightly insulted when John Wilkes Booth went the old-fashioned route with a pistol. Later presidents also occasionally relied on unofficial tasters. It was never as formalized as in Europe, but the paranoia carried across oceans. Because let's be honest, nobody in power has ever really trusted what's on their plate. The Great Shift, from tasting to testing. By the late 19th century, science finally began to make food tasting obsolete. Chemistry labs were springing up. Doctors and scientists were starting to analyze food for toxins. Slowly, rulers realized that you didn't actually need some poor courtier to chew a drumstick. You could send it to a chemist, which meant the role of the food taster became increasingly ceremonial. In some royal households, tasters remained for tradition's sake. The idea of someone testing the monarch's dinner was reassuring, even if the real safety came from chemical analysis. And after their monarchs died, those tasters, they were either shuffled into kitchen management, or they simply became historical footnotes. So what did it feel like? Now, let's pause and imagine the psychology of being a food taster in the 18th or 19th century. You're sitting there, watching the king gorge on venison stew, while you take careful bites in advance. Everyone watches you. You're invisible most of the time, but hypervisible for 10 seconds before every dish. If you hiccup, the entire room gasps. If you cough, people whisper about poison, and then the monarch dies anyway. Not from poison, but from gout, tuberculosis, revolution, or a guillotine. And you just keep living, possibly unemployed, possibly forgotten, definitely never eating mushrooms again. That was the life. High stakes, no glory. Trusted, but disposable. A career designed to end the moment your boss did. So, the industrial age had arrived. Science was advancing. People could now test for arsenic in a lab, rather than relying on some poor noble with indigestion. And yet, rulers kept their tasters. Because what's tradition without a dash of paranoia? And the 20th century was very good at paranoia. 2 world wars, revolutions, dictatorships. If there was ever a golden age for the food taster, this was it. Adolf Hitler's Poison Squad. Let's start with the most famous case. Adolf Hitler. Now, Hitler had a lot of phobias. Germs, illness, betrayal, you name it. He was also a vegetarian, which he claimed was for health reasons, though most historians suspect it was also about paranoia. But even lettuce can be poisoned, apparently. So Hitler had a team of food tasters. Dozens of them. Most were young women, recruited from the surrounding villages. The idea was simple. They'd eat the vegetarian meals prepared for him at his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, and wait to see if they keeled over. One of the tasters, Margot Wolk, later told her story. She was in her mid-20s when she was conscripted into the role. Every day, she and about 15 other women would sit down and eat Hitler's food before it was served. Potatoes, rice, vegetables, very bland, very German. And then, they'd wait. Because poison doesn't always act immediately. Sometimes they had to sit there, anxious, wondering if the cramps in their stomachs were fatal or just nerves. Wolk survived. She lived to be 96 years old. And in interviews decades later, she admitted the job was terrifying. Not glamorous, not rewarding, just endless fear every single day. And what happened to her after Hitler died? Well, she was free, but traumatized. She admitted she couldn't enjoy food for years, which honestly makes sense. Stalin's dinner table. Now let's float over to Russia again. If anyone could outdo Hitler in paranoia, it was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was famously distrustful. He had bodyguards taste his meals constantly. In fact, his personal chef, Spiridon Putin, yes, related to Vladimir Putin, was responsible for preparing his meals, and tasters were always present. Stalin would sometimes watch them eat before touching his own food. Did it work? Sort of. Stalin didn't die from poison. He died from a stroke in 1953, possibly made worse because his guards were too afraid to enter his room when he collapsed. Which is grimly ironic. The tasters saved him from imaginary poison, but not from his own circulatory system. And what about those tasters? After Stalin died, they just lost their jobs. No fanfare, no acknowledgement, just quietly reassigned or retired. Another round of forgotten stomachs. Mussolini's Italy. Benito Mussolini also relied on tasters. He loved his food, especially pasta and heavy sauces, but he feared assassination. So his meals were checked before they reached him. The irony here? Mussolini wasn't poisoned. He was executed by partisans, shot, and hung upside down in Milan. His tasters, if they survived the war, probably just blended back into civilian life, never having tasted anything more dangerous than slightly undercooked ravioli. Winston Churchill, overcautious gourmet. Not all tasters worked for dictators. Some were there to protect democratic leaders too. Winston Churchill, for instance, often had soldiers or aides sample his meals during wartime. The British Prime Minister was known for his love of rich food and alcohol. Champagne at breakfast, brandy before bed. Churchill worried about assassination, especially when traveling. So tasters were assigned on foreign trips, particularly in the Middle East and Soviet Union. And once again, they probably ended up tasting more whiskey than poison. But it was a job. And when Churchill died peacefully in 1965, the tasters, forgotten, their service swallowed by history, Hirohito and Japanese continuity. Meanwhile, in Japan, the imperial court still kept tasters as part of tradition. Emperor Hirohito during World War II had food checked constantly, not just for poison, but for quality and ritual purity. Even as bombs fell, the symbolism of tasting remained. And when Hirohito lived on until 1989, the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history at that point, his tasters aged quietly alongside him. Their careers faded, but the role technically never ended. Even into the 21st century, whispers remain that Japanese emperors still have tasters, though more for tradition than necessity. The modern poison patrol. So here's the shift. By the late 20th century, food tasters were less about actual poison and more about security theater. Leaders still feared assassination, but they relied more on labs, chemical testing, and controlled kitchens. The human taster was almost ceremonial, but not always. In some regimes, especially where paranoia ran deep, tasters still had a very real, very risky role. Saddam Hussein, for example, reportedly had food tasters who sampled every dish. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya supposedly did too. And North Korean leaders? Let's just say, if you're serving Kim Jong-un his ramen, you're probably not eating first for fun. The psychology of dictator dining. Now let's step back for a sleepy thought. Imagine being one of Hitler's tasters. Or Stalin's. You don't like them. You don't support them. But you're trapped in their orbit, chewing their potatoes, praying you don't die that day. Then one day, they die. Not from poison, not from anything you could have prevented. And you're free. Sort of. Free, but with years of fear etched into your body. That's what happened to Margot Wolk, Hitler's taster. She survived the war, but when asked about it later, she said she never fully escaped the fear of food, which is maybe the saddest legacy of all. Not dying for your dictator, but living with their shadow in your stomach. The fate of 20th century tasters. So what happened after the leaders died? It was the same as it had been for centuries. They were dismissed, forgotten, sometimes stigmatized because who wants to admit they kept Hitler alive one more day? Sometimes honored quietly, but rarely publicly. And once again the pattern holds. The king dies, the dictator falls, and the taster? They fade back into the crowd. Their strange job erased unless, like Margot Wolk, they happen to tell their story decades later. The enduring symbol. By the close of the 20th century, food tasters were less about safety, more about symbolism. They reassured leaders who didn't trust anyone. They played the role of living shield, even when science made them technically obsolete. And after the leaders were gone, they returned to anonymity, which has been the quiet fate of tasters for over 2,000 years. So, you'd think that with modern chemistry labs, advanced forensics, and entire teams of professional chefs, the job of royal or presidential food taster would finally be extinct. But nope. The 21st century, with all its technology, still hasn't killed the very old tradition of, make that guy eat it first. Because leaders, just like emperors and popes before them, still don't trust their food. The US presidents and the mystery taster. Let's start with the United States. Officially, the White House doesn't admit to having a presidential food taster. But it's one of the worst-kept non-secrets in Washington. Reports pop up every now and then, like in 2009, when President Obama visited a Senate lunch and didn't eat. Why? Because his food taster wasn't there. Senators were baffled. But insiders quietly explained, the president never eats anything that hasn't been cleared first. The Secret Service oversees this. Sometimes it's a military aide. Sometimes a food security officer. They sample dishes before the president eats. It's not a glamorous job. It's not even officially acknowledged. But it's there. And if a president leaves office or dies, the tasters? They're reassigned. Probably never mentioned again. So yes, the job survived. Quietly, invisibly. The Vatican, still keeping the faith, and the tasters. Over in Rome, the Pope still has his food inspected. Some sources claim he still has a taster, though nowadays it's more about checking for quality than poison. Pope Francis, for example, has said he eats simple meals. But given the Vatican's long history of political intrigue, nobody is surprised that some version of the pregustator still lingers. It's one of those jobs where, if it exists, nobody brags about it. Which makes sense. You wouldn't want to be interviewed as the guy who eats in case the Pope gets poisoned. Not exactly the kind of resume line that wins you job offers later. Japan, tradition marches on. Japan is one of the few places where the role of taster is still openly tied to tradition. The imperial household still maintains elaborate rituals for food preparation. Some of this is ceremonial, rooted in Shinto concepts of purity. But there are also whispers that the emperor's meals are still tasted before he eats, partly for safety, partly because tradition never dies easily in Japan. So even today, in the age of neon Tokyo skyscrapers, someone might be quietly chewing rice ahead of the emperor. Russia and the poison legacy. Now let's drift back to Russia, because if there's any country where food tasters are still relevant, it's Russia. Modern Russian leaders, especially Vladimir Putin, are said to have strict food security. Officially, the Kremlin says nothing, but journalists and defectors have claimed that tasters are part of his personal security detail. Every dish, every drink, checked. Because in Russia, poisoning isn't just a historical rumor, it's a recurring headline. From opposition figures to defectors abroad, poison keeps showing up, which makes the presence of tasters around the president feel almost inevitable. And when Putin eventually leaves the stage, however that happens, his tasters will probably vanish again. Unnamed, unrecorded, swallowed by the same silence that's covered their profession for centuries. Other modern leaders. North Korea? Yes. Kim Jong-un reportedly uses tasters. Probably several. He's famously paranoid and extremely protective about his food. Stories trickle out through defectors. Tasters sample every dish, every bottle. Whether it's caviar, instant noodles, or imported cheese, someone else chews first. Saddam Hussein had tasters too. So did Gaddafi. In unstable regimes, it's almost a guarantee. The more dangerous the politics, the more tasters at the table. Even in democratic countries, it hasn't disappeared. German chancellors have their food checked. British monarchs have their meals secured. The Queen of England wasn't likely to be poisoned at a garden party. But Buckingham Palace still had rules about who touched and tasted food before it reached her. The ceremonial survivors. In many places today, tasters are more about ritual than real fear. The Japanese emperor's rice isn't going to be laced with arsenic, but someone will still sample it. The Pope isn't going to be slipped cyanide in his soup, but his food still gets checked. This has become almost symbolic, a nod to tradition, a reminder that leaders still live in that strange space between fear and ceremony. The after the boss dies problem. But here's our ongoing theme. What happens when the boss dies? Nothing glamorous. Just like in Rome, just like in Versailles, just like in Hitler's bunker. The tasters quietly lose their jobs. Maybe they're reassigned to some security office. Maybe they fade into private life. There are no statues of tasters. No epic memoirs. The rare exception, like Margot Wolk, only surfaced because she lived to old age and decided to tell her story. Otherwise, silence. The same silence that has always followed them. The weird comfort of food tasters. So why do they still exist? Partly because food is intimate. Leaders can have armies, guards, and walls, but when they put something in their mouth, they're vulnerable. A taster is a simple, ancient reassurance. A reminder that someone else took the risk first, and partly because traditions die hard. Monarchs and dictators alike love rituals that make them feel safe. And tasting is one of the oldest. Sleepy reflection. So here we are in the 21st century. Airplanes exist. Satellites exist. Artificial intelligence exists. And yet, someone somewhere is still chewing the king's chicken leg to see if it's safe. And when that king dies, the taster will do what tasters have always done. Step aside. Fade out. Disappear into history. Another invisible stomach swallowed by time. Closing drift. And that's the strange continuity of the food taster. From Roman pregustators to medieval squires to Renaissance courtiers to Hitler's poison squad to modern Secret Service staffers, the story is always the same. A quiet, anxious figure at the table. Never the star. Always the disposable stomach. Always forgotten the moment their master dies. Which makes their story, oddly enough, one of the longest-running traditions in history. Not glorious. Not heroic. Just endlessly, quietly, there. One of the funniest and also saddest things about royal poison stories is how rarely the poison actually existed. More often than not, rulers just assumed it was everywhere. Every goblet, every plate, every pie. And that assumption shaped entire courts, entire kitchens, and entire careers of tasters who never once encountered real poison. The medieval poison scare. Take medieval Europe. If you flip through chronicles, you'll see an endless parade of poisoned cups and meals. Kings mysteriously dying after a banquet. Queens wasting away after a feast. But when you strip away the superstition, most of these cases were food poisoning. Or dysentery. Or just bad medieval cooking. Half the poisoned at the banquet stories were probably just, "Congratulations. You ate unrefrigerated venison in July." But medieval people didn't know about bacteria. So they went with the explanation that made sense to them: murder, poison, conspiracy. And once that fear set in, tasters were locked into their strange profession forever. Catherine de' Medici and the perfumed poison myth. Now let's glide into the Renaissance. Because if you want paranoia, France in the 1500s was chef's kiss. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, was constantly accused of poisoning people. Not because she actually did, but because she was Italian and Italy was infamous for poison rumors. Add in her love of perfumes and potions, and suddenly every death near her became poison. Historians think Catherine probably didn't poison anyone. But her reputation? Absolutely toxic. People whispered that she had perfume bottles filled with venom, gloves soaked in death, food laced with invisible powders. And of course, every time she sat down to dinner, tasters had to prove nothing lethal was lurking in the soup. Which, again, almost never was. The unicorn horn cure. Here's a weird little side path. Royal courts were obsessed with antidotes. One of the strangest? The unicorn horn. Kings and queens paid fortunes for what they thought were powdered unicorn horns that could detect poison. Spoiler, they weren't unicorn horns. They were narwhal tusks sold by clever traders from the Arctic. Supposedly, if you dipped the horn in a cup, the poison would neutralize. Spoiler again, it didn't. But rulers still had these horns mounted on their dining tables like trophies. And tasters? They had to play along. They'd dip the horn, nod gravely, and then still take a bite of the food. Because hey, double protection never hurts. The poison dwarf and court rumors. Jump forward to the 1600s, and paranoia reached new theatrical heights. At some courts, tasters weren't just there to check the food. They were accused of causing the poisonings. After all, who handled the food before the king ate it? The taster. That meant tasters often lived in this bizarre double bind. Trusted enough to risk their stomachs, but distrusted enough to be suspected of being the poisoner. One German court even spread rumors about a so-called poison dwarf, a servant blamed for mysterious illnesses. No proof, just gossip. But once the paranoia stuck, tasters had to live with the constant fear of being accused if their master keeled over. Russia's endless suspicion. Back to Russia, because Russia really leaned into poison paranoia. Tsar Ivan the Terrible believed that poison was everywhere. He didn't just have tasters. He had entire food rituals. Special kitchens, special utensils, special guards. He rotated servants constantly so nobody could build a secret plot. And yet, Ivan died in 1584, probably of natural causes. Same story with later tsars. A little stomachache after dinner? Clearly poison. Never mind that Russian cuisine was drowning in heavy meats, vodka, and questionable preservation methods. A taster could drop dead of indigestion and people would still swear it was arsenic. Napoleon and the arsenic theory. Napoleon Bonaparte, another favorite for poison conspiracy fans. He died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, and almost immediately, rumors spread that the British had poisoned him, specifically with arsenic in his wine or wallpaper. Modern science eventually tested his hair and found traces of arsenic, which sounds suspicious until you remember that arsenic was in everything in the 1800s. Cosmetics, wallpaper, even candles. So did Napoleon die of poison? Probably not. He likely had stomach cancer, but the myth stuck. And once again, the idea of poisoned meals loomed larger than reality. The Victorian poison panic. The 1800s gave us another fun chapter. The Victorian poison panic. Cheap, brightly colored dyes often contained arsenic. Women wore dresses literally laced with poison. Wallpaper shed arsenic dust. So when someone got sick at dinner, poison was the easy explanation. Royals, nobles, anyone important, all believed their food needed to be tested. Because who knew that green pudding might be fashionably lethal? Tasters didn't vanish. They just became duller. Less about real threat, more about ritual. But the myth of constant danger kept them in business. The irony of rare actual poisonings. Here's the ironic part. Real poisonings of monarchs were extremely rare. Sure, a pope here and there might have been slipped something suspicious. A duke might have died too suddenly. But compared to all the paranoia, the actual numbers are tiny. The vast majority of royal deaths came from disease, terrible hygiene, overeating, bad medical treatments. Basically, life was already trying to kill them without help. But because poison felt like the most personal form of attack, the fear never left. And tasters? They lived in that fear, acting out centuries of ritual against a danger that was mostly imagined. A gentle drift. So here's the sleepy takeaway. Food tasters lived more in rumor than in reality. They weren't dying left and right of poison. They were chewing bland roasts and sipping mediocre wine, day after day, while their bosses twitched with paranoia, which makes their story less about death and more about fear. Fear that was powerful enough to create jobs, rituals, and myths that lasted centuries. Being a royal food taster wasn't just about drama. Most days weren't thrilling. In fact, the job was about waiting around. Endless waiting. You'd be summoned hours before a banquet. You'd watch the kitchen staff prepare course after course. You'd sit at the edge of the dining hall, eyes glazed, stomach growling. Because, well, your job was to taste, not to feast. And the waiting part? Nobody writes about that. But it probably felt like most of your life. Early mornings with the royal kitchen. A day in the life usually began in the kitchens. Royal kitchens were bustling, smoky places. Huge fires, sweating cooks, the clatter of iron pots. If you were a taster, you had to be there early. Not to cook, but to oversee. Your role? Stand awkwardly in the corner. Watch ingredients get chopped. Nod as everything went into the pot. Wonder if you should say something when the chef sneezed into the soup. Because if the king got sick, you might get blamed anyway. Tasters often had to record where ingredients came from. Meat from this butcher. Wine from that vineyard. Bread baked in this particular oven. All to create a traceable chain of safety. So before tasting even began, there was paperwork. Medieval-style paperwork. Quills, seals, signatures. Imagine being hired to risk your life, and instead spending your morning shuffling parchment. The first bites. Then came the actual tasting. And no, it wasn't always a dramatic first bite of every dish. Sometimes tasters sampled just a portion. A spoon of stew, a chunk of bread, a sip of wine. Enough to test. Not enough to ruin the king's plate presentation. Which meant you rarely got a real meal. You lived in a state of constant appetizer. Half-chewed bites, half sips, never full, never starving. The cruel irony? The food was usually good, lavish, rich, full of spices ordinary people couldn't dream of. And you got just enough to make you want more. Imagine being surrounded by roasted swan or candied fruit. But every bite you took was rationed and suspicious. You didn't get dessert because dessert might be deadly. Waiting games. Here's a fun detail. After tasters sampled food, they sometimes had to wait. Not every poison kills instantly. Some take minutes, hours, even days. But rulers had banquets to attend, and nobody wanted to watch their taster digest for 6 hours. So most courts compromised. Tasters sampled dishes about 30 minutes before serving. If they looked fine after half an hour, the king felt safe enough. This created weird downtime. Tasters sitting there, glancing at their own hands, wondering, do I feel dizzy? Or is it just hunger? Meanwhile, everyone else just watched. Dinner theater, but the show was anxiety. Social standing trusted, but never trusted. Now let's talk about status. Food tasters technically had high trust. They touched the king's meals. They could whisper in his ear, "Safe, sire." They were allowed near royal lips and royal stomachs, which was intimate in its own way. But socially, they weren't equals. You could be promoted from the kitchen or plucked from low nobility, but you'd never fully escape suspicion. People always eyed you like, you're close to the king, but maybe too close. Nobles resented you, servants envied you, guards tolerated you, and the king himself, he trusted you until he didn't. One wrong look, one untimely illness, and suddenly you weren't loyal. You were suspect. So tasters often lived in an awkward in-between, elevated above the average servant, but never embraced as true insiders. Mealtime position. During banquets, tasters didn't get to sit comfortably and join in. They usually hovered, standing behind the royal table, cup in hand, napkin ready, watching. Some courts gave tasters a small stool nearby. Others made them stand through hours of feasting. Either way, you were never far from your boss's plate. You were the human insurance policy, and you probably developed the worst back pain in Europe. Health hazards of the job. Now, here's something that rarely gets mentioned. Tasters probably got sick a lot. Not from poison, but from overeating weird combinations. Sampling dozens of dishes every day. Rich meats, sweet sauces, heavy breads. Your stomach didn't thank you. Add in questionable medieval food storage, and it was almost guaranteed you'd spend nights doubled over with indigestion. But here's the kicker. If you looked sick, everyone assumed poison. So you couldn't even complain. You just had to burp politely and insist you felt fine. Being a food taster was basically a lifetime subscription to stomach cramps, disguised as loyalty. Relationship with the king. This part varied. Some rulers treated tasters like family. Others barely acknowledged them. In some accounts, kings would chat lightly with their tasters during meals, almost like a dinner companion. But most of the time, tasters were background furniture. Silent, dutiful, present only to nod reassurance. And if the king died suddenly, you'd better vanish fast, because grief turned to suspicion very quickly. End of the day. After the banquet, tasters often retired not to luxury, but to modest quarters. They weren't usually showered with riches. Their job wasn't glamorous. Maybe they received leftover scraps, food that nobles didn't touch. Maybe they curled up in a servant's bed, stomach still aching from sampling, brain still replaying, "Did that sauce taste funny?" And the next morning, back to the kitchen smoke, parchment records, and nibbling anxiety. That was daily life. Not drama, not instant death. Just the slow grind of trust and suspicion, a gentle drift. So when we think of food tasters, we imagine sacrifice and danger. But really, it was a job of waiting, sampling, and worrying. Less heroic martyr. More glorified taste tester with constant acid reflux. Still, they shaped royal dining. They were the invisible shadows of every feast. And their strange halfway status, trusted but never embraced, makes them one of the most quietly tragic roles in court life. The king is dead. The court is silent. Everyone is suddenly whispering about succession, inheritance, and mourning attire. And right in the middle of this swirl, the food taster, a figure who had spent years nibbling suspicious bread rolls, and now had to figure out what came next. Immediate panic. Here's the thing. When a king or emperor suddenly died, especially if food was involved, the first suspect was almost always the taster. Even if the monarch was 90 years old and had survived 3 strokes, someone would still mutter, "Maybe the soup was poisoned." And who tasted the soup? That poor guy in the corner. So for tasters, the moment of royal death wasn't quiet grief. It was pure damage control. Do you flee? Do you swear loyalty to the next ruler? Do you loudly insist that the king actually died of natural causes? The safest move? Probably to vanish before the body got cold. Blame game. History is littered with examples of people scapegoated after their bosses died. Poison was an easy explanation for sudden death, especially when doctors had no clue what was happening inside the human body. A stroke looked like poison. An aneurysm looked like poison. Even overeating goose liver looked like poison. And if you were the person officially assigned to prevent that, congratulations, you've just been accused of failing. Or worse, of being the one who did it. This is why many tasters ended their careers not in peaceful retirement, but in interrogation. The lucky ones. But not all endings were grim. Some tasters had enough loyalty points saved up to transfer into the service of the next monarch. For example, in several European courts, tasters weren't just individuals, they were families. Dynasties of nibblers, if you will. Father to son, uncle to nephew. If one king died, the next ruler often kept the same family of tasters around. Because trust was inherited. Sounds strange, but imagine being born into a line of professional eaters. Your father chewed suspicious meat for the king. Now it's your turn. That was your family legacy. So for these families, the death of one king wasn't a disaster. It was a job transfer, a quick rebranding. Pension plans? Did tasters get retirement benefits? Sometimes. Wealthier courts occasionally gave old tasters a small stipend or land. After all, if you'd risked your life at every banquet, you at least deserved a vineyard to collapse in. But more often, tasters simply slipped back into obscurity. Their names weren't celebrated. They didn't get statues. They didn't write memoirs titled, How I Ate for Kings and Survived. They just became former servants. The kind who quietly mentioned, decades later in the village tavern, "Oh yes, I once tasted the emperor's wine," and nobody believed them. The sad reality of sudden deaths. If the king's death was sudden, tasters could even end up executed without trial. Take, for instance, the Byzantine court. When emperors keeled over, the palace guards usually killed everyone within arm's reach, just to be safe. Tasters included. A clean sweep of suspicious people before anyone asked too many questions. That meant your whole career could vanish in one heartbeat. Literally. One moment you're chewing on spiced lamb. The next, your emperor clutches his chest, and suddenly your head is on the block. Fading of the role. By the early modern period, as courts became more bureaucratic and less paranoid, the food taster's role began to fade. Why? Because poisoning became rarer. Not non-existent, but less practical. Guns, daggers, and battlefield accidents were much faster methods of assassination. And frankly, royal doctors were doing enough damage on their own with medical treatments. So tasters became ceremonial, still present at coronations or grand feasts, but more as tradition than necessity. A nod to an older, more paranoid era. By the 18th century, many tasters were really just courtiers in fancy clothes. They'd poke at dishes, smile politely, and reassure everyone that the soup was perfectly safe. Their real function was symbolic reassurance, not actual poison detection. After retirement. So what did tasters do once their service ended? Some became minor nobles. If they'd gained favor, they might be rewarded with a small estate. Some went into religious life, because after years of watching people panic over invisible poison, monastery silence probably sounded nice. Most just disappeared. They melted back into court life, perhaps taking another administrative job. Maybe handling wine cellars. Maybe watching over kitchens. No one carved their names into marble. They didn't get heroic ballads. They weren't remembered like knights or generals. They were functionaries. Essential but invisible. The irony? Their entire existence was about preventing tragedy, yet their own fates rarely earned more than a footnote. The ultimate irony. And here's where it gets almost poetic. Many kings and queens who had tasters still died of food poisoning. Because not every poison is immediate, and not every illness is detectable. Meanwhile, many tasters probably died of perfectly ordinary causes. Heart disease, overeating, old age, things their job couldn't shield them from. So the people who lived in constant suspicion of poison often ended up being victims of life's more boring killers. Which feels very on brand for history's quiet servants, floating toward the end. So what happened to royal food tasters after the kings died? Sometimes they were scapegoated. Sometimes they were spared. Sometimes they slid into new roles under new rulers. and sometimes they just vanished into anonymity. They were creatures of court paranoia, and when that paranoia faded, so did they, which makes their story oddly comforting. They weren't glorious,